Good afternoon. My name is Esther Park. I have the privilege of working with Maria on a weekly basis. I am the piano professor here at Trove School of Music, and I welcome you to this afternoon's lecture recital. Maria comes from Greenville, South Carolina. She has undergraduate in piano performance degree from Cleveland Institute of Music. She comes from a family of pianists, and it's been a ball to have her in our studio as kind of class mom. Speaking of which, to remind you that we have a week full of piano performances. So today's Maria's recital. On Wednesday at 1 o'clock, you will find us here again for Noah Waddell's senior recital. On Friday, in Legacy Hall at 7:30 after the viola studio recital, we are presenting piano studio recital of 5 piano concerti, an event that you do not want to miss. And lastly, on Saturday at 7:30 in Legacy Hall, you'll hear some great chamber music involving horn, piano, violin, as well as clarinet and cello. If you're intrigued, we're there on Saturday evening at 7:30. Without further ado, please do silence your phone. It's a lecture recital, so Maria's got a great topic that she's going to talk to you about. So it will be great if you can silence your phones. And please welcome Maria.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for coming today. It's wonderful to see all of these faces in the audience, for me to talk at you for 30 minutes, so I appreciate your presence. Today we'll be presenting on the noble and sentimental waltzes of Maurice Ravel. Ravel had actually begun in 1906. He wrote to a friend and expressed his interest in the joie de vivre of the waltz form. He loved the rhythms, and he expressed his intent to write La Valse, which is his most famous grand waltz. And he did not complete it until 1920, but in 1906, it was known by a different name. It was known by the name Vienna, and he absolutely intended to write a piece that would refer to Johann Strauss, that would bring out the grandeur, the spectacle of the grand Viennese waltz as it was at that time. Now, knowing this, these noble and sentimental waltzes appear to be a return to the fundamentals of the waltz for Ravel. These are much smaller. There are multiple of them. La Valse is one gigantic 13-minute waltz. This is a little longer, but it's split up into 8 parts, and they are much more small, compact in form, and as well as texture. And it appears to me that Ravel was returning to kind of the fundamentals to see exactly what curated the essence of the waltz. Now, La Valse has more complex rhythms, more compound melodies and themes, in contrast to the largely motivic content of the waltzes I'll play for you today. But many of the memorable themes of La Valse have a corresponding prototype in this set of waltzes, which to me shows a little bit like he was using this set of waltzes to as sort of a testing ground for La Valse. He was fleshing out ideas and treating them in his typical, very curious, very precise way, with a lot of harmonic, tweakings that still allow the ear to follow a harmonic narrative, but add some color that Ravel really excelled at writing. So I see this set of waltzes as a bit of a laboratory for the ideas that he then expands upon in La Valse. And because of this, he returned in this piece not to the grand waltzes of Johann Strauss, which at that point were largely these aristocratic, massive event dances. These were something for celebration. These were something for generally the upper class. And Schubert, in comparison, wrote two sets of waltzes. One was called the noble waltzes, and the other were called the sentimental waltzes. There are 12 noble waltzes and 34 sentimental. And these he wrote not for some grand performance, not for really even the concert stage, but more for an intimate setting in which you might read them at home on your spinet and dance with whoever was around or have a small gathering with friends. And for this reason, I think Ravel really enjoyed this very unassuming humility of these waltzes. And he brought elements of Schubert to the set as a way of preparing to write basically the opposite of these Schubert waltzes in La Valse. So a little bit of history. This piece was composed in 1911. So if you remember, he wrote to his friend that he had conceptualized this piece, Vienna, which would later become La Valse. He conceptualized that in 1906. And then 5 years later, he writes this set of pieces. And then the following year, he orchestrated them and actually wrote his own narrative for a ballet to accompany them called Adelaide, or the Language of Flowers. And I'll give a quick overview of the narrative because I think it's helpful in listening to the piece. It's not necessarily, I don't know if he necessarily was thinking of it when he wrote the initial piano version, but it is his own narrative, and so it is definitely his reaction to what he wrote. So the first movement is a soirée at Adelaide's home. There are dancing couples, seated, walking, conversing tenderly, and Adelaide comes and goes among her guests, inhaling the fragrance of a tuberose, symbolizing voluptuousness. And this is his writing. Number 2, Loredan, one of her two suitors, enters, sullen and melancholy. He offers Adelaide a buttercup. An exchange of flowers expresses Adelaide's fickleness and Loredan's love. In the third one, she picks the buttercup to pieces, one petal at a time, and sees that Loredan's love is sincere. Loredan plucks the petals of a daisy to reveal that he is not loved. Adelaide wishes to renew the test. Once again, he tries. This time, the reply is favorable. And so in number 4, the two lovers dance while revealing their affection. But Adelaide sees the Duke enter and stops in some confusion. In number 5, the Duke gives her a bouquet of sunflowers, symbolizing vain wealth, and then a jewel case containing a diamond necklace, which she puts on. And in number 6, this one describes Loredan's despair and his ardent pursuit of Adelaide while she rejects him very coquettishly. And then number 7, the Duke begs Adelaide to grant him the last waltz, and she refuses. She proceeds to fetch Loredan, who has remained aside in a tragic pose. He hesitates at first, and then is won over by her tender persistence. In the final movement, which is the only one with a name that's not the tempo marking, and this one is called the epilogue, the guests retire. The Duke hopes that he will be asked to stay, but Adelaide offers him an acacia branch representing platonic love. The Duke leaves, indicating his displeasure. Loredan advances, sad almost to the point of death. Adelaide offers him a poppy, symbolizing an invitation to forget her. but he refuses and runs out making gestures of eternal farewell. Adelaide goes to the rear window and opens it wildly. She deeply inhales the scent of the tuberose. Scaling the balcony, Loredan appears wild-eyed with disheveled hair. He rushes towards Adelaide, falls at her feet, and takes out a pistol which he places next to his temple, threatening suicide and smiling. Adelaide draws a red rose from her bosom, symbolizing her true love, and falls into Loredan's arms. And so you might also hear some similarities between this and La Dame aux Camélias by Alexandre Dumas, or what we in the music world might know as the plot of La Traviata. And the symbolism of the flower and of these very, seemingly trivial objects is mirrored in the inscription that was written in the first publishing of the piece above the beginning of the score. And this is a quote from Henri Regnier, "The delightful and always novel pleasure of a useless occupation." So this seemed to be Ravel's mentality in this piece. It was premiered on May 9th, 1911, and its performer, Louis Aubert, the work is also dedicated to him, but he was the only person who knew who composed this work before it was premiered. So in 1910, a collection of students of Gabriel Fauré had founded the Society for Independent Music in Paris, and this was in response to the fairly conservative National Society of Music, which they viewed as a bunch of purists, and they were following mostly in the tradition of César Franck. They had rejected performances of works by Ravel and by Charles Koechlin, and they said, well, we'll make our own society. So the SMI, the Independent Music Society, elected Fauré the president, and their aim was to champion more progressive French compositions of the time. Not only French, Béla Bartók, Zoltán Kodály, other common composers of this time who happened to reside in Paris were also part of the society. So one of the ways that they championed new compositions was to premiere works without revealing their composer until after the performance. And this was premiered at a concert with multiple works that were all anonymous. And so the encouragement to the audience was that they evaluate what they were hearing at face value without letting their biases sway their assessment of each work. Of course, this backfired a little bit because they were thinking, well, I think this person wrote this and I don't like their compositions, so I'm going to ferociously critique it. And then as soon as they heard that it was Ravel, they backpedaled quite a bit. And so in the end, its anonymity turned out to detract from its reception, and actually several in the audience ascribed the pieces to Kodály or to Erik Satie. And only a small percentage guessed correctly, although after Ravel was given away as its composer, he wrote of the hoots and catcalls that initially accompanied the performance of the piece. Now, you can hear some Satie, and I'm going to play a bit of movement 2, because I think that this certainly, if I were hearing it on first hearing in 1911, I think I would have also thought that Satie wrote it. This is very similar to the Gymnopédies of Erik Satie. And Debussy actually wrote of the piece that it is the product of the finest ear that ever existed. So not everyone was a critic. But they also may not have identified it as Ravel's, because he had just written what he intended to be the hardest piece in the piano repertoire, Gaspard de la Nuit. And This piece, by comparison, is much leaner in texture, it's smaller in scope, the movements are shorter. Just by glancing at the score, you can tell it would take fewer hours to learn than the million notes in Gaspard. And there are much darker, more intricate layers. There's a bit of murk that you hear in Gaspard that doesn't really exist in this piece, which is very light and precise. And so the audience would have had this freshly in mind when thinking of Ravel's piano repertoire. And I don't think they would have expected him, after writing that massive piano work, to return to this very simple texture and these compact, concise forms. And then he takes his influence from Schubert. And I think that even though he had treated them, the motifs that he received from Schubert in these kind of melodic contours, he treated them with polytonality, rhythmic displacement, plenty of color, some harmonic tricks here and there, but this was still not something that they were used to from Ravel. They were used to a little bit more development and a little bit more wandering than I think he gives you in this piece. So its relationship to Schubert, noble and sentimental waltzes, was first articulated by Ravel, and here's a quote from him. The title, Noble and Sentimental Waltzes, sufficiently indicates that I was intent on writing a set of Schubertian waltzes. The virtuosity, which was the basis of Gaspard de la Nuit, has been replaced by writing of obviously greater clarity, which has strengthened the harmony and sharpened the contrasts. And another scholar, Dr. Richard Dowling, wrote that Schubert's waltzes were composed between 1823 and 1825, and it is their lilting and distinctive Viennese rhythm, rubato, balanced phrases, straightforward form, gliding middle voices, melodic suspensions, and unexpected harmonic subtleties that attracted Ravel. And so what I intend to do is to provide some examples of all of these as they appear in both the Schubert and also in the Ravel. Now, Schubert's waltzes are altogether more earthy and more simple than those of Johann Strauss. And actually, some of the scholarship on this work maintains that the connection to Schubert is only in the title, and that he was still pulling from the influence of Johann Strauss. And I disagree. I think that you can find Schubert all over this piece, starting from the very first measure. So I'll play the opening of Schubert's Noble Waltzes, and then the opening of Ravel's, and you can decide for yourself. Same rhythm, just displaced actually by a beat. And so Schubert treats the 2/8 notes as a pickup, and Ravel places them on the downbeat. However, Schubert's pickup is also accompanied by fortissimo and an accent, so the rhythmic displacement is almost written in, and Ravel takes full advantage of this. The contrasting theme of Ravel's first waltz also holds some similarity to one of the sentimental waltzes. And so in the Ravel set, you can hear that in the longer waltzes, which would be number 1 and number 7 especially, these really have a little bit more contrast. There's more action in the form. And he uses this opportunity to draw from both the noble waltzes, which are a little bit larger in texture, as you just heard, and the sentimental waltzes as contrast within the same movement. So here is that contrasting theme, and then also the 7th of the Schubert sentimental waltzes. don't necessarily share a melodic contour. Ravel liked to borrow, but not necessarily to steal. He had plenty of ideas of his own. But it does share a similarity in something that we see very often in Schubert, which is the sort of compound eighth note melody where you can separate it into the upper voice or into the lower voice, and they both move very intimately, sort of following each other, and it's very idiomatic for the piano. To do this kind of rotation. And it's also very reminiscent of the yodeling textures that you might hear in Schubert, not only in these pieces, but also in his other works. This is a bit from his Sonata in D major, D850. So with this, Ravel has constant revolving figures throughout this piece. And he uses it also, not only in this, but in the valse, which we will come back to later. But he has a recurring motif revolving around a fourth, and you can find it structurally as well as in the melodies. So I'll play a few selections from the Ravel, starting with the very opening. So harmonically he goes. And then this becomes the second theme. And this recurs also in one of the middle sections of the third waltz. And so this ties the movements together thematically. You hear a little bit of it in every movement. Those are, I think, the most obvious. And this, again, hints at these yodely figures of Schubert. Now, in Schubert, they're typically thirds and sixths. For Ravel, he loved chordal harmony, and he has quite a few instances where the fourth is used purposefully to create just a little extra chromatic tension within the piece. And for me, it's interesting that he chose these instead of the very smooth parabolic melodies of Chopin, which I will demonstrate. So he could have written this much more laid back, much more sentimental, and I think a little bit more melodic waltz, but he liked the textures of Schubert. And he also used Schubert's pacing in this piece in every movement. And so Schubert has this little trick that if you've found a piece that you really love by Schubert, it's usually about 20 minutes long, and there's about 8 bars in it that makes the whole piece worth it. And he does this through color changes, chromatic medians, either going to major 3 or major 6. And in general, he had a very sensitive ear for the colors that he was creating at the instrument and the pacing of when exactly those colors would be most effective in that piece. And so I'll play one of the Schubert waltzes for you, and then I'll play waltz number 4 for you. And you can hear that in both of these, he has a color change at exactly the same place, or each composer has a color change at exactly the same place, which coincidentally is kind of at this 3/4 mark right before it, which you might see as following also the golden ratio rule of pacing that we find in a lot of art and a lot of music as well. So here's the Schubert. In that Schubert, he brings you to D major out of C major, which is quite far. And similarly, in the Ravel, he takes you to a very pianissimo, very purposeful drop in color at exactly that same 3/4 mark in the piece. So this is just one of many examples throughout the Ravel of this type of pacing and this strategic distribution of color throughout the piece. Ravel had immense coloristic ability as a composer, but he knew as well as Schubert that it was most effective when it was least expected. And also in the sentimental waltzes of Schubert, he begins with a waltz in C major, and then he writes almost an exact inverse of it in B flat 4 waltzes later. Each piece in both of these sets, not just the sentimental waltzes, but also the noble, they're remarkable for how blurred the distinctions are between each of them. Each one almost sounds like a variation or a paraphrase of the previous one. He brings back themes that he just finished 2 waltzes ago, and he said, you know, I'm not quite done with it, let's do it again. And This is comparable to the way that Ravel, in the epilogue of this set of waltzes, he goes back and refers to every single previous movement. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but I will play for you just the beginning of that waltz in C major and the one in B flat so you can hear how similar they are. And in the epilogue of the Ravel, he actually has a moment where he switches between 3 of the previous movements, and you'll hear this more vividly in the full performance, but here's a little sample. So you just heard examples from actually 4 of the preceding waltzes, all within about 16 bars of the last movement. And so I think that this is also a part of the sentimentality of these pieces, is that these waltz strains are very simple, but they never leave your head. You would find yourself singing them for, days after reading through them. And in the Schubert, if you sing one, and I've had this experience in preparing for this where I had one stuck in my head and I wasn't quite sure which one it was, and it turned out to kind of be a composite of 2 or 3 that I had heard in the set, and I was writing my own. But this sort of amalgamation of themes, and these themes are very close to each other, also for me demonstrate how accessible these pieces were and how relatively tuneful and simple they were in regards to Schubert's other music. Now, I want to bring the noble and sentimental waltzes of Ravel now in comparison with La Valse, because at this point, Ravel has drawn the essential elements of the waltz from Schubert. He has drawn these rhythmic patterns, these very simple, small, fragmented melodies, and really explored them to their complete potential, I guess. And when he writes La Valse, he then takes these ideas and distends them past the point of recognition. And I actually played this piece at Spring Harbor yesterday. And I had an audience member come to me unprompted and say, wow, I like that piece, but it sounds so much like La Valse. And there are bits of this everywhere in La Valse, and so I want to draw a couple of those examples, and then I'll talk about why it is so crucial that he drew from Schubert first. So this revolving figure of the fourth waltz, which I compared to Schubert's yodeling, is very similar to these portions of La Valse that build on the opening theme. Even the very first melodic fragment that appears, which would be this. And he takes that and uses it as a developmental element later in the piece. So towards the, when things are really ramping up, we're no longer in a lively ballroom. Things are getting a little scary at this point in La Valse. Here's what you might hear in the upper voices. And this is very related to the fourth waltz of the Noble and Sentimental Waltzes. Another thing that he takes from the Noble and Sentimental Waltzes, and he puts right in one of the most significant moments of La Valse, is this element from the seventh waltz. So in La Valse, he himself described it as the moment when the grand ballroom actually appears in full vision, and you can see these couples whirling around the room. And this is at rehearsal number B in La Valse. And here's what he writes, which is quite similar to what you just heard. Very similar rhythmic schemes, and also very similar between. So same rhythm and same place in the piano, which for Ravel is also significant. And then later he has this figure that really pushes the rhythmic impetus and the tension and the instability of La Valse forward. And this is something that he also takes from the Noble and Sentimental Waltzes. And so I'm only going to play the upper voice of this because it's quite hard. But in La Valse, here's what he does. And then also later. So he takes that from the sixth waltz of this set. But the way he uses it in La Valse is altogether much more menacing and very much an element of instability, whereas here it's the waltz that is supposed to illustrate Loredan's pursuit and Adelaide's coquettishness. And so lastly, there's an interesting floating duple texture in the very opening of La Valse, and this has more relation to directly the piano reduction of La Valse, which he wrote after the orchestral version was published. And in Noble and Sentimental Waltzes, he has an element in the seventh waltz, which is quite polytonal and also has this similar duple over three texture. And so in La Valse, this turns into the actual opening theme as it's starting to come through the clouds that Ravel himself conceptualized in this piece. And this is also a texture that he takes not only from Schubert, but from Chopin. Chopin did this a lot in the scherzi for piano. Lastly, he had a... he has a quote which I referred to before, and I want to share it in full before I bring up the very end. And so when he writes his own narrative for La Valse, it's that through whirling clouds, waltzing couples may be faintly distinguished. The clouds gradually scatter. One sees at letter A an immense hall peopled with a whirling crowd. The scene is gradually illuminated, and the light of the chandeliers bursts forth at the fortissimo at letter B, which is that shared theme between the seventh waltz of the set and of La Valse. And the structural instability that he creates using the hemiola throughout this is something that is kind of charming in the noble and sentimental waltzes. He uses it very sporadically, but he does use it in every single movement. In La Valse, he uses it as a rule, and it's something that pushes the piece forward and really creates this sense of, this is a waltz, but it is also something else, something is going wrong. And so you will hear that all over the place in the set of waltzes. And I do not play La Valse, so I will allow Dr. Park's lovely recording from her recital to be your example for that. And lastly, I would like to point at the epilogue and how it prepares a little bit, sets the stage for La Valse. So there's a scholar, Michael Parrini, who, I hope I'm saying his name right, engages with the concept of memory, involuntary and voluntary, as it functions in the epilogue. And so voluntary memory would be when we go to try and remember something, when we say, what did I do that day? What was I wearing on the first day of fourth grade or something like that? Whereas involuntary memory is something that is described in Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And this requires a trigger of some kind. This is maybe an unexpected circumstance that would be the catalyst for a very vivid, immediate memory. And so for me, this would be the smell of lavender soap, which every time I smell it, I think back to my grandparents' house in Italy, and it's more vivid than if I were to just try and conjure up that memory unaided, I guess. In Proust's case, it is the famous Madeleine dipped in lime blossom tea, which floods him with a memory of his childhood. And here's a quote from that. In that moment, all of the flowers in our garden and in Mademoiselle Swan's park and the water lilies and the vivons and the good folk of the village and their little dwellings and the parish church and the whole of Combray and of its surroundings taking their proper shapes and growing solid, sprang into being, towns and gardens alike, all from my cup of tea. Now, for Ravel, in this epilogue, it's not a taste or a smell. It's actually a touch, and it's the geographical location of the hands on the keyboard. Throughout this epilogue, he actually finds himself in the places where the previous waltzes occurred and writes in this seemingly spontaneous change of heart where the pianist finds themselves at this register, and so they play a little bit of the fourth waltz and of the sixth, and then they move up here and they play a little bit of the third. It's always in the realm of pitch or the register of each waltz as its original iteration appeared. And this is a kind of compulsive nostalgia that's written into the epilogue so that gradually drifts away into these fields of memory. And at the end, it is marked en se perdant, losing itself. And to conclude, I would like to draw attention to the final note of this piece. And this is probably more a coincidence than anything, but he does end the set on the lowest G of the piano, and then he begins La Valse on the E, F, and A flat surrounding it. So I'll play a little bit of the end of this set of waltzes, and then the beginning of La Valse. So it starts in the exact same place on the piano. Of course, La Valse began as an orchestral work, but it did have an original iteration as a two-piano piece, because that's what Ravel played with Marcel Meyer, and the piece was rejected as a ballet by the great impresario Diaghilev, who said that this is not a ballet, this is a portrait of a ballet, and so I'm not going to stage it, but good job. This, for me, creates a nice continuity in these waltzes, descending into the same clouds that dissipate to reveal the grand ballroom of La Valse, all in Ravel's own conception. So with that, I'm going to take a tiny rest, and then I will come back in about 2 minutes and perform the whole piece for you. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, please save them for after the performance. Thank you.